Okay, let's start back with some, let's first go over weathering and mass wasting, and we'll cover weathering first. So again, these are our external processes or denudational processes that include weathering, mass wasting, and erosion. And the first step is weathering. So let's discuss weathering for a moment. This is about the breakdown of rock into smaller pieces because of exposure to weather. Thus the name. And we can break weathering down into two general types. One is mechanical, or sometimes called physical weathering. This is some type of non-chemical things that are happening, some mechanical action that will break up rock. And there's also chemical reactions that play out as well, and thus the name chemical weathering. So first, let's discuss some mechanical weathering. One is a good example is frost wedging, also called freeze-thaw weathering. So in cold mountainous environments where you have granite rock and you can get cracks in the rock, and in some places water from rain can get into those cracks, and just like when you leave a soda in the freezer, that water can expand like the soda does in your freezer, and it can expand and crack the rock. Another one is unloading, and unloading is a process. So hopefully you saw the film about the formation of Yosemite, and one thing they talked about is how that granite had been buried over long periods of time. Then when it became exposed, you had a release of pressure of the rock, and that caused it to break up. So that release of pressure of buried rock, like the granite under Yosemite, is what's called unloading, and that will cause an expansion of the rock once it is unburied. So again, you have underground rocks under pressure because at one time they were buried underneath the ground. And then as erosion removes the material from on top of them, that takes the pressure away. And the outer layers of the rock will expand, and then that leads to another process called exfoliation. And so this is caused in the video. The lady used the deck of cards to illustrate how rocks in Yosemite are cracking and falling. And so this is unloading will cause what's called exfoliation, where rock layers will peel away like the layers of an onion, and they leave behind a dome shape called an exfoliation dome. And what is a well-known exfoliation dome not far from us? And as a hint, it's only half of the dome is present, and that would be Half Dome. Half Dome is an excellent example of what's called an exfoliation dome. So this is Half Dome in Yosemite, but part of it has been cleaved away because of glaciation, but it is an exfoliation dome. If you look closely at it, you can see these sort of flaky layers that are, because of unloading, are becoming detached from the rock, and they're susceptible to rock falls. And it's not the only one. There's a series of exfoliation domes throughout places like Yosemite Valley because of this unloading process. If you look closely in the Sierra Nevada, you can see the rocks are kind of like an onion layer where they're peeling off, and then that makes them vulnerable to rock slides or rock falls. And chemical weathering is, like it sounds, it's caused by chemical reactions. So for example, when you leave metal material outside, it can rust, and that is an example of a chemical weathering process. And the two can work together, that you can, mechanical weathering can break up the rock and expose it and make it more vulnerable to then chemical weathering. Just a couple of quick examples. The oxidation is the rusting of rock. So in some parts of the world you have red rock that's caused because the iron within the soil is rusting. And another one is called carbonation. And carbonation is where acidic water will actually eat away at certain types of rocks, particularly one called limestone. And carbonation is what makes what's called karst features or caverns. So there are some karst features in California as well.